Do you want to know the best settings for recording video on your camera? If so, stick around for this video. What's good YouTube, JSoloFilms here, and I'm back for another video, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to dial in the settings on your camera so you can get the best look straight out of camera with no editing in post. A lot of these things you wouldn't be able to fix in post anyways, but it's just how you would get the best look out of your camera. I do want to note though that these settings will work for all cameras that are manual, Sony, Nikon, Canon, doesn't matter, you're covered. I know these tips might sound advanced, but just stick with it. They're actually really easy when you put them into practice for a while. First thing we'll be looking at today is the frame rate. So I'm going to be using the abbreviation FPS a lot. That means frames per second, so how many frames your camera takes per second to stitch together that video. To get a cinematic look, you use 24 frames per second. That creates natural motion blur. As you can see, my hand looks like it's actually moving motion, it's not choppy. There's another reason why it looks like that, but we'll explain that later. For average content creation, you usually use 30 frames per second. That's like vlogs and just normal YouTube videos, but I always use 24 even in vlog. For slow motion, you're gonna wanna use 60 frames per second or higher. Some cameras can do 120, 240, and even higher than that sometimes, which is crazy. I've never had a camera do over 240. The only camera that I have that does 240 is my GoPro, my smartphone. DSLRs and mirrorless cameras really never go over 120 FPS. But 120 is great because it's like that perfect line of slow motion that you can slow it down to. It just looks so good. I use it a lot. All right, don't look at me. Maybe I use it too much, but I like slow motion. Now for shutter speed. This is a pretty simple one. Basically, all you have to do is keep your shutter speed double your frame rate at all times. Unless you're doing some action shot where you don't really want to slow down the motion, you just want to make it look more rough, like, if some guy's punching somebody or something like that, then you might want to like up it to 500th of a second. But right now, I am shooting in 24 frames per second, so I'm gonna be shooting in 50 only because this camera can't do 48 of a second. So there'll be that little slider at the bottom. You're gonna wanna go to 50 most of the time with all consumer cameras. But if it does do 48, then go for it. But it's highly unlikely. All shutter speed really means is how long the camera shutter is actually open inside. It's just a measurement. I know guys, this is starting to sound pretty advanced. Just stick with me, don't give up on this. Like I said, it's pretty easy when you put it into practice. So here's the problem with shutter speed. If you want it to be double your frame rate and you're outside in midday, if you're all the way at 50th of a second, things are gonna be blown way out at midday. Right now, I'm at 50th of a second at f1.4, but that's because it's literally past sunset right now. I'm actually shooting past sunset. Still looks good, and that's only because I waited this long. Right now I'm only shooting an ISO 200. We'll talk more about that later. But back to the shutter speed thing. If you can, I recommend picking up an ND filter. Mine's pretty bad, degrades the image quality a lot, so I don't really use it, but I'm gonna pick up a better one at some point, but they are kind of pricey for the best ones, especially when you consider what they are. They're basically just sunglasses for your camera. Literally, that's what they are. So they allow you to have your aperture more wide open and your shutter speed lower. We're gonna talk more about aperture too. I know I'm mentioning so many things at once, but they all link together. So to talk about one, you have to talk about the other. So now about aperture. And before I talk about aperture, I want to mention this camera is on a propane tank right now, and I really hope it doesn't fall. Aperture is just how wide open the lens is, and that depends on how much light actually gets let into the sensor. The wider your aperture, the better the image quality is going to look in low light. But if you have a wide aperture outside in midday, it's just going to overexpose it if your shutter speed's too high. So now that you know what aperture is, back to shutter speed, you're going to need to turn down that shutter speed if you want blurry background. If you want that good cinematic blur on the hand and all that, then you're gonna wanna turn down the aperture. So it's gonna be one or the other if you don't have an ND filter. You're either gonna have less bokeh in the background, or you're going to have that choppy look whenever you move, and it's just not gonna look good. So your choice. I recommend just turning down the aperture when you have to. But what I really recommend is getting an ND filter. I just don't have one yet. I wish I had a good one, but I don't. I really, really wish I did though. Now that we've talked about aperture and shutter speed, back to aperture once again. I kind of already told you this, but the lower the aperture, the blurrier the background. So if I was shooting right now at like f6, then for one, this would be way underexposed because it's past sunset. And for two, those trees up there would not have any blur on them pretty much at all. And having that aperture at f1.4, which is honestly really, really low for an APS-C, but having that f1.4 makes this a lot easier. Without this f1.4, I would not be out here right now. I'd be inside for sure. Bringing that back to inside also, shoot at the lowest aperture you can inside also, unless you have good lighting. The reason I say that is because it's gonna mess with your ISO or ISO, however you wanna say that. That's the next thing we're gonna talk about. These things all link together, like I said. Now ISO or ISO, however you wanna say it, that's digital brightness. Keep that as low as you can at all times unless you actually need to boost it. You don't want your image to be dark, but you also don't want to see all kinds of grain all over the place. Like right now, if this was at like 6400 ISO, you would see grain all along this, and especially right here in this dark area. Right now I just checked and I'm still filming in 200 ISO because of that f1.4 lens. When I say f1.4, I'm talking about f-stop, which is aperture. I don't know if I clarified that, so there you go. So yeah, don't let your image underexpose, but don't let it be grainy either. So try to keep it at a happy medium if you have to. But if you're outside midday, keep that ISO at 100 always. Just flatline bottom 100. That will ensure that you have the least grain possible out of your camera. So if you're shooting inside or if you're shooting at night, get that fast lens, crank that aperture up, crank that ISO down, and you're good. But I understand sometimes you do have to crank the ISO up, but it kind of sucks when you have to. I understand though. Trust me, I'm somebody who used to only use a Canon wide-angle lens that was not fast at all. ISO had to be bumped up to 6400 for like 30% of my shots or more, which that's not good at all. But like I said, it's not gonna like take away from the content as long as it's not like professional, but especially if you're shooting some professional, don't be shooting really over 1600 ISO, to be honest. But hey, now that I have this good lens for low light, I can actually make a video about shooting in low light. So if you guys would like to see that, about taking videos and photos at nighttime, be sure to let me know. Just drop a comment in the comment section below. So now we'll be talking about white balance. This scares a lot of people, and I understand you're messing with color science at this point. But if you think about it, all it does is change the color of your image. You don't necessarily have to understand the numbers, so I'm not gonna go into them. I understand basically what they mean, but it's all on like a Kelvin scale. A lot of times if you're loading up like Premiere or something like that, you'll see the slider, and the further to the left it is, the cooler, further to the right it is, the warmer. It's basically like setting that in camera, but you definitely don't want to mess with trying to fix white balance in post. So if you're doing a big project, definitely just set your custom white balance. But if you're working on something like a YouTube video, you can either use auto white balance or you can go in and use the preset. So if you're indoors, use tungsten. Most of the time people have tungsten light bulbs. Unless you have one of those LED or daylight bulbs, then use daylight. And if you're shooting outside in the daylight, obviously use daylight. And if it's cloudy outside, you use cloudy. It's pretty basic when it turns into that type of stuff. Like if you want to use those presets, go ahead, but using auto in most newer cameras will work pretty good. But honestly, I found, and I don't know if this is true, this might be me, but the lower the ISO, the better the white balance, I feel like in auto. Whenever you have to turn up the ISO, I feel like the white balance doesn't know what it's doing as well. That's not a proven fact. Like all the rest of the stuff I've told you has pretty much been facts, but that I feel like is kind of a self-observed thing. I've always had more problems at higher ISOs when it comes to white balance. Never really looked into it though. I could probably find out pretty easily. But about white balance, I'm gonna be honest here, I usually use auto. Like right now I'm using auto and the white balance isn't even off, but not all cameras are good at that. So be sure to check that yours has good auto white balance before you go and use something like that. And if you're gonna use it for a big project, don't be using auto white balance. It's probably not a good idea. So yeah, that's the basics on how to use your camera for video and get the best settings. If it does sound confusing to you guys at all, be sure to let me know any questions that you would have in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to answer them the best that I can to give you guys the best information, because I did put a lot of effort into this video, but there could be something I left out. So yeah, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you guys did enjoy, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe for more video and photo tips and also cinematics. When you guys do subscribe, be sure to ring the notification bell. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.